Hello, I'm Jon Faine and welcome to Monash Law's In Conversation live on LinkedIn. And before we go any further, I'd just like to express my personal impatience for a treaty or treaties to go with that acknowledgement of country that we've just played for you. My impatience for a treaty or treaties in order to try to address some of the mistakes that we've made in our past, without which I don't think we can as a nation move on. That's maybe a topic for another one of our In Conversations. There's 4 in the series. And with a couple of false starts, it's wonderful to be able to welcome, for the first of our live broadcasts, leading business figure and philanthropist, Carol Schwartz. And Carol, thank you very much for giving us your time this evening.
Oh, well, thank you so much for inviting me, John.
It's wonderful to have you here. Now, there's so many different things, so many different hats that you wear: philanthropy, business, property, all sorts of things. But particularly, you've emerged strongly as a leader. So for you, whether we're talking any of those fields, what does leadership mean to you?
That's such an interesting question. I think leadership is about actually courage and also recognising leadership and strengths in other people and bringing that out in others. I think that's so important. And I think that is in fact true leadership, is recognising skills in others and bringing them to the fore.
Where did you learn that?
I think I just learned it through experience. You know, that working with a whole lot of people, you really learn where you're weak and where others are strong and where they can fill your gaps. And I think recognising that, acknowledging it, being able to be a good delegator and, you know, making others feel really good about themselves and their own strengths, I think just makes one a good leader.
We're 1 minute into this conversation, which is going to go for an hour, and you've just said something that no man would ever say if they were asked the same question.
And what's that?
Acknowledging where you're weak.
And why do you think men won't admit that?
I ask the questions here. Why do you think? Why do you think?
I'm also very good at asking questions.
Why do you think that's something the alarm bells ring, I immediately identify as such a female leadership thing to say, as opposed to a male leadership thing that would never be said?
That's so interesting that you say that, because so very often when you have these sorts of conversations, people actually say, well, you know, the differences between men and women are so exaggerated, and at the end of the day, those differences don't really exist. So I'm interested in why you would think that a man wouldn't say, you know, I have to be aware of my weaknesses in order to be a good leader. I mean, it's obvious, isn't it?
No, it's not. You've been on millions of boards. You're on the board of the Reserve Bank. You're on the board of major philanthropic bequests and organisations, public sector, private sector, chaired the Property Council. When's the last time you heard a senior male in a business or other leadership positions say that they acknowledge their weaknesses? It just doesn't happen.
Yeah, well, I guess you've spoken to more men around this sort of, or in the context of them being able to express that than I have. I guess around a boardroom table, people aren't going to say, well, you know, these are my weaknesses and I look for people to fill those gaps. So maybe in your interviews with people, you are more exposed to that than I have been.
Well, in politics, for instance, and you do a lot, although you're not a politician and you're not
definitely not a politician,
and you're not an active player in politics, but you're very involved in nurturing the next generation of women in politics, which we'll talk about in a moment. But when's the last time you heard a politician admit their frailties and weaknesses, let alone a mistake?
Well, you know, I think that's a real shame, actually. And in some way, some maybe perverse way, I actually feel sorry for politicians not being able to do that, because I think that if you could actually say, look, I've stuffed this up and I'm really sorry about it, but, you know, I've learned from that and let's proceed in this way, I think everybody would be much happier, because no one expects perfection. So I'm wondering why politicians think that citizens expect perfection and, you know, and completely, you know, perfect sort of responses to situations, particularly like now that we're dealing with, which we've never experienced before.
You're talking about the pandemic and the crisis that comes with it. Well, no one will admit to an error because they're worried that that's a concession or an admission that you never recover from.
But it's a concession that you're human and we're all human at the end of the day.
It's interesting. We'll come back to this, but I touched on the fact that you're helping nurture the next generation of women in political leadership positions, and it's not bipartisan, it's cross-party.
Absolutely.
Not bipartisan, but
it's
across.
Completely politically agnostic.
Well, tell us about it. How did it come about?
Well, interestingly enough, it actually came about.
So what it's called?
Pathways to Politics for Women.
And it's done through the University of Melbourne.
University of Melbourne, QUT in Queensland, and now UNSW. We're very excited because we're basically up and down the eastern seaboard.
And it's been going for how long now?
Well, our original program, which was with Melbourne University, has been going for about 6 years.
And so you've had how many women now go through?
We've had over 200.
Okay. And some of them are now popping up in federal, state parliaments and local government.
Absolutely. Representing all political parties at all levels of government, at federal, state and municipal.
So what did you identify as the need for exactly a program? Describe what it does, how it nurtures aspiring women politicians and what you thought the need was.
Okay. Well, the need came about when we only had one woman around our cabinet table, and I was shocked and outraged by that. I could not believe that here we were in the 21st century and we had one woman around our cabinet table, our premier decision-making table on a national level. We had one woman. After all this conversation about how we need diverse boards, how we need diverse people around a decision-making table, we ended up with one woman out of 22 cabinet ministers. And I was absolutely outraged by that. And I discussed this with a colleague who is the Dean of the Women in Public Policy program at the Harvard Kennedy School. And I said to her, what are you doing about getting more women into politics? And she told me about this program that they do from Harvard Square to the Oval Office, which sounded absolutely fabulous. And I said, could we adapt that for Australia? And she said, absolutely, we're happy to help you in any way we can.
No need to reinvent the wheel.
Exactly. Why duplicate when you've got a fabulous precedent to work from? And they were so incredibly helpful at Harvard. And I actually approached Glenn Davis. And I said to him,
who was then the
Vice Chancellor of Melbourne University, and I said, have I got a program for you? It's extracurricular, and I would like to support it. In fact, my family would love to support it through our family foundation.
You mean pay for it?
Exactly. Philanthropically support it, pay for it. Because what we didn't want to do was to create an elitist program that participants would have to pay for, which potentially meant that you would be alienating a certain group of potential participants.
But you'd be prioritising people who could pay and leaving out those who couldn't.
Exactly. Yeah. Absolutely. We didn't want that to happen. So Melbourne University was incredibly responsive. And in fact, Nick Rees, who was in Chancellery at that time, really helped put together the program. A fabulous woman called Meredith Martin, who's still there, who is absolutely integral to the program, was there from day dot, making it happen. And I had said to Glenn, I want this to happen, a pilot in 6 months, which was apparently absolutely unheard of. But we set to work on it. And I have to say the commitment, the conviction, Nick, Meredith, the people they brought around the table, Andrea Carson, who joined the program, absolutely phenomenal. And within 6 months, we had a fantastic program to really put out there. And we got a fantastic response of over 100 women putting themselves forward in a guinea pig type situation.
Sure. And what do they actually get in the program? Because now, as you say, it's growing. It's like cane toads. It's spreading across the country.
Yeah.
And it's clearly identified a coterie that appreciate what's on offer. What actually happens in a
well, what we try and do is create modules that they train the women, and also we bring in politicians, both male and female, to talk about what the real world of politics looks like. So in an evening, we have 10 sessions usually held in an evening. And the first half, which is about 1.5 hours, is a workshop. And we cover off very practical things like fundraising, ethical dilemmas in politics. Now, that was one thing that Harvard did not have as part of their program. But we thought it was absolutely crucial. I mean, when you think about the sorts of issues that a politician has to deal with, a lot of it has to do with ethical dilemmas. And I'm not cynical about politics or politicians. I think that people go into politics because they're actually really idealistic and they believe that they have a contribution to make to society and how our society could be better. I really believe that. And so therefore they're confronted with ethical dilemmas when they join a party where maybe their personal ideals are having to be compromised in some way. So solving ethical dilemmas in politics, media, how to deal with the media, how to present yourself, how to do a stump speech, how to put yourself forward for pre-selection, what to expect in the pre-selection process, how then to put yourself forward to an electorate, how to create policy, all the sorts of things that, a politician should be informed about are the sorts of things that we cover off on in the program.
And the people who are doing the talking are practitioners. They're people who have been through politics. I mean, I understand Peter Credlin, for instance, has very generously been giving her time, and she's one of those that makes a presentation.
She's been fabulous and one of the most popular speakers that we have year on, year out. And as I said, we have our cohort represent all sides of politics. And Peter is so generous and so open and so transparent in those meetings. And I do have to say, we enforce Chatham House rules very, very strongly so that the participants feel that they can discuss anything in a very, very open and clear way. And I have to say that what we do is we really curate the program and the participants so that you don't have, let's say, like-minded people sitting next to each other during every program. We make sure that they're really mixed up so that what we're doing is we're actually training politicians who learn how to negotiate outcomes and hopefully come to decisions that will work for us as a society in the most productive way.
The sisterhood has come up for a mention in the fabulous television series that Annabelle Crabb has put together for the ABC that's showing at the moment called Misrepresented. Are you trying to create a future sisterhood amongst women in politics?
Look, I wouldn't call it a sisterhood, but I would say that if we can create as a norm, a women's caucus going forward, and that become an acceptable way of politicians getting together to help sort of resolve issues and negotiate outcomes, I think it's very productive. I can't see anything negative about that at all, can you?
Oh, not for a second, but there are still so many people who are, for whatever reason, either threatened or challenged by it. But let's flick the switch from politics to business, because you've also been kind of smashing through glass ceilings in the world of business too. When you started out, were you treated as a bit of a novelty? Were you treated in a bit of a patronising, condescending, oh, well, look, let her have her 2 bobs worth, but then we'll just keep doing what we were doing anyway?
Yeah, I think that was an attitude, and I'm talking about 30 years ago now. And I remember being totally outraged by that. And I remember actually being on a panel with an older woman who was probably my age now, who said
38.
Who said to me, change will happen. You have to be patient. And I was beside myself. I felt like giving her a slap. Right? And I would have been in my early 30s then. And now I'm that older woman. And I can see myself having to tell younger women, this is going to take time. And unfortunately it is, because look how we're still discussing these issues, 30 years later, when I thought that we would have had everything resolved for my daughters and granddaughters, we're still discussing the same issues. So what does that mean? have I failed, or is social change just take a bloody long time to happen?
Well, you're turning around the, not the
Yes.
Titanic. No, you're turning around
An ocean liner.
An ocean liner, or I was going to say a battleship, but all the
Yeah.
same. Now, it's a feature of these In Conversations that we can receive live questions from the audience, and there's one exactly on point. So I encourage people, in fact, to send in the questions, and I'll ask them as they come through. But Ellie wanted to know, do you think there have been positive changes in workplace gender discrimination during and because of the pandemic? Do you think that's actually had an impact? So not just looking over the period of time since you entered the workforce, but specifically, do you think it's accelerating because of what we're going through now?
Yeah, Ellie, that's such a great question, because I think that the biggest change has actually been around flexibility and remote working, because of course flexibility has always, and remote working has always been seen as a woman's issue. And now we're all working remotely. We're all working in such a different way that it's no longer seen as something we give women. This is now an accepted form of working that not only women but men want and really appreciate. And I think that workplaces are actually appreciating the productivity that can happen through people not necessarily having to be in the same physical place all the time. And I think that we're all learning from this.
I think it's also, in a kind of perverse way, it's had a reverse effect. Not reverse as in sending it backwards, but it's also impacted on a lot of male CEOs and a lot of male bosses who hadn't appreciated just how complicated it can be in the past, because they were in the cocoon of the office.
Yes.
And it was out there. It wasn't my problem, but now it's not. And they're working from home, a lot of them. And they've seen it firsthand, and they've gone, okay, now I understand what I never understood before. It's a bit like, men who go and take parenting leave and find themselves in the role reversal. Spouse goes off to work and they're at home with little kids, and they go, I had no idea. You just, so much to do. Yeah.
Well, I remember when my son-in-law, he and my daughter moved with their 3 little children to London, and he's a surgeon. And my daughter got a job straight away when they were in London. So he basically took 6 months off to look after the children. And he said it was the hardest work he'd ever done.
Yep.
And he's a surgeon.
Yep.
So, and it's relentless, but let's face it. But
there's that mind switch then for him.
Absolutely.
Appreciating what hadn't been appreciated before. I went through it myself years ago. Yeah.
Absolutely. But, the interesting thing is that the data shows that women still, through the pandemic, took on the bulk of the homeschooling and the domestic side of what needed to happen, which is a bit of a shame. And didn't happen in all cases, because a number of really fabulous young men who I spoke to through the pandemic just so appreciated the time that they had at home, the time that they had with their children, that it's actually made them rethink their whole lifestyle going forward. So I think that there have been pluses and minuses with this, and that's not to in any way understate the pressure on people, on families through this pandemic.
I think it's brought forward a few midlife crises into earlier than they might otherwise have happened.
Yeah, but there have been, it swings and roundabouts. There have been some really interesting learnings through this, and also some very, very difficult times.
Yep. Amanda says, by way of comment, Pathway to Politics is an excellent program. Congratulations. It's building skills and confidence, helps give great women the capability to run for office. It's also about confidence building. And then you realise you're not the only one to have to deal with this. But as well as celebrating that, and it's been a great innovation, and I'm sure, in hundreds of years when it's still running, they'll say, how did this ever get started? And people will say, oh, there was this woman, Carol Schwartz.
Well, I can't wait till we get our first woman Prime Minister, second woman Prime Minister or third woman Prime Minister who is actually a graduate of the program.
Because you've got some federal members of Parliament.
Oh, we have. Yeah, Katie Allen, fantastic.
Member for Higgins, Liberal Party.
Yeah, she's fabulous. Yep. And, she was such a great contributor to the program because, of course, she's been a paediatrician. She's lived in the real world. And she knows what that's all about. And she's brought all those skills to the program and now to politics.
Can I turn it around? I don't know, do you get to meet every single woman who goes through the program?
Well, I did.
For
I
a
must
while.
say, the first 2 years, I went to every session. I loved it.
Sure.
But then I thought I had to let go.
Yeah,
You know?
but I guess what I'm driving at is, do you see there's a type coming through?
No. Apart from an openness and I guess in a funny sort of way, an admission that we have something to learn through this program, and a role in politics or a life in politics is not an as of right, you know, sort of situation. No, there's not a type. I mean, these are really fabulous, smart women from very, very diverse backgrounds, because that's one of the things that we want. We want women from very diverse backgrounds. We've had psychiatrists, we've had architects, we've had some lawyers, teachers, doctors, such diverse women, and you know, different ethnicities, different ages. We really go for as much diversity as we can, and that really adds to the richness of the program and the experience. I mean, and this is what we're looking for in corporate Australia, isn't it?
Which we will come
boards.
to. We will come to. We'll come to business and money, and I want to ask you about education as well and universities, because it's critical. But let's still stick with politics, because the national capital has been embroiled, as I'm sure everybody knows, in all sorts of recent scandals, not just from, you know, the Bonk ban and Barnaby Joyce, but through to Brittany Higgins and the allegations that still have not been in any way tested, and no one's even been charged yet. And there's still some argy-bargy even today about where the brief is and whether it's ready or not. Noreen has said that Misrepresented has highlighted the dire situation for women in Canberra. I'd like to know how we can encourage migrant communities to come forward and participate in political spaces. And what about the discouraging misogynist culture in Canberra? First of all, do you agree, as Noreen asserts, that it's a misogynist culture?
Well, I would say it's a very male-dominated culture.
Still.
And I would say, absolutely. And I would say that this is a culture that's been around for over 200 years, right? I mean, politics and the political system in this country was set up by men for men. And we as women are sort of infiltrators into that culture. And it's really interesting to speak to women politicians, because there has to be a level of adaptation if they're going to survive. You know, and I think in Misrepresented we saw Amanda Vanstone, Bronwyn Bishop, I mean, even Sarah Hanson-Young, who's fabulous and who's been such a fantastic contributor to our program, said, you know, for the first few years she felt, you know, I'm just going to suck this stuff up and, you know, get on with you know, being a politician and making a difference. And, you know, I've interviewed Kate Ellis about her book and why, you know, women don't talk about the issues that they're dealing with. And she said, you know, we come into politics idealistic and with a view as to how society can change and be a better place for all citizens of Australia. And we don't want to start focusing in on this, what we're hoping is petty stuff that we have to deal with on the sidelines.
But it's not petty.
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? It's actually not petty.
It's fundamental, it's foundational.
That's right. And it sort of takes over. I mean, look what Sarah Hanson-Young had to deal with.
Yep.
I mean, imagine...
You mean with David Lionheim?
Well, yes, and also, I mean, it showed in Misrepresented, you know, that she would stand up and present whatever it was we was talking about, and was being catcalled in the most atrocious way, whilst she was trying to be a serious politician.
Yep.
Why is that behaviour allowed? I mean, you wouldn't allow that behaviour in a kindergarten, let alone in, you know, in a political environment.
And no one would try it now in serious corporate Australia. I mean, you know, just
absolutely not.
Absolutely.
It would be totally unacceptable.
yeah. And yet
Imagine,
politicians seem to think there's some sort of force field around them.
well, imagine, you know, in a board when you're presenting a particular argument or as somebody next to you abusing you. I mean, that just would not happen.
No. So having dealt with the question that Noreen asked about whether the misogynist culture, in the second part, she wants to talk about women of an ethnic background. I'll come to that. But before we get there, just do you see that there is, whether it's through kicking and screaming and, you know, politicians being dragged through the muck in Canberra, do you think this is a watershed moment, or
aren't we all hoping it's a watershed moment?
How do you make sure it is?
Well, I think you've got to be vigilant. And I think Kate Jenkins, for example, I mean, she is no pushover.
The Sex Discrimination Commissioner?
Yes, who's doing the report into parliamentary behaviour. And I think she's looking at presenting some sort of code of conduct.
Yes, and there's going to be a new complaints office, but it won't be retrospective in its ambit. Yes.
Well,
I wonder why.
Yes. I wonder why.
But once it's up and running, depending on how it's auspiced, resourced, and its guidelines, surely that's a point of no return for this sort of stuff.
Well, absolutely. I mean, you would think that the mere fact of a complaints office being set up will be a disincentive to that sort of behaviour, because who wants to be, you know, presented to the complaints office? You know, that's going to be terrible.
There should be a 3 strikes and you're out policy, really, shouldn't there? I'm just thinking, because of the Olympics, you know, you can have a, like in soccer with the cards.
Well, they do that on boards as well.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, 3 no-shows and you're off the board.
Yep.
Yeah. So, well, you know, who knows what Kate's going to present. I mean, maybe that will be part of it. But as I said, she's no pushover. So I think that there will be changes, and I think that there will be changes for the better. And when we say a watershed moment, let's hope so, fingers crossed. But, you know, again, behaviours have been going on for an extremely long time. And we know that behaviours are very, very difficult to change. So it's not going to necessarily change overnight, but I think that incrementally it will change. And along with that change, we'll probably see more women entering Parliament, because it's going to be a place that's more embracing.
It's more diverse now than it's ever been, but we're still a long way short of the sort of diversity that is absolutely the norm now in Canada, in the UK, in Germany, in France, New Zealand. We're still a long way behind, although it's very different to how it used to be. So,
and why do you think that is? Why do you think that Australia is so far behind these other jurisdictions?
Again, I asked the questions, Carol, but there are all sorts of possible explanations, but I think there are structural barriers. I mean, on the left of politics, the trade union movement and the professions are the drawing ground, and they're a long way behind. On the right of politics, the Liberal Party draws on the business community, and we'll get to your experiences there. The National Party draws on the farming community. There are barriers to women in all of those different empires that politicians are drawn from.
So interesting, because as I said, in Pathways to Politics, we have applicants from all sorts of different backgrounds, and we make sure we are as inclusive as possible. So we've had brilliant young African Australian participants, we've had Asian Australian participants, we've had culturally diverse and linguistically diverse. It's been phenomenal. We had a fabulous woman in our last cohort who was actually from the Ukraine originally, and a woman in her 50s. So, you know, we just bring together a really diverse group, and I guess facilitate, you know, the best possible outcomes as to how they can work together.
Oh, may we get to the point where we don't even have these conversations anymore. Let's switch from politics to business, because you've been a pioneer in that field as well. And if I started reciting all the boards you've been on and all the different contributions you've made, we'd pretty much run out of time. But you came in through the property industry fundamentally, and that, let's not pretend, it was through family connections and your parents' business interests, which
I was in a family business.
Yeah, but a considerable one. It's not like a corner milk bar, is it? Let's not pretend.
They always start off like that.
It's a very big empire, and a very sophisticated and a very successful one. So, I mean, you were the boss's daughter, which kind of makes it a bit easier, doesn't it?
That's really interesting, because I guess, you know, I never wanted to be the boss's daughter.
No, but you were. So,
you know, the first business that I set up was actually an aerobics and dance studio, which had nothing to do with the boss.
Really? I never knew that.
Yeah. It was an aerobics and dance studio, which
What
I set up.
were you
at the age
Jane
of
Fonda,
23.
were you?
Yeah, it was exactly, exactly. Sweatpants, headbands, and leg warmers.
Okay.
It was fantastic. I actually, what I did was I renovated a little sort of old factory building that was in Little Latrobe Street, just down from RMIT, into 3 dance studios. And I had as my teachers VCA graduates in dance. And so for the first time I had dance teachers as aerobics teachers, because I had been to Jane Fonda's workout in LA for 2 months and done the courses there and brought back all the tapes and trained these fabulous young dancers as to how to be aerobics. And we were one of the first aerobic studios. This was in 1981.
I never knew any of that.
Really?
But then from there to the great heights of, ultimately, I think you chaired the board of the Property Council and so on, and ran a major shopping centre development. I mean, they're not baby steps. There's huge leaps there. So how did that come about?
Well, I mean, I had studied law, and after I did my aerobics and dance studio, I actually sold it to a client when I had my first child, because running a business like that is very, very difficult to be there at 6 a.m, at 9 o'clock at night when you've got a little baby. So I sold that business and went back to uni, Monash Uni, and did my MBA. Actually, Alan Fels was the dean of the business school at that time. Used to teach.
I did a subject with Alan Fels as well, trade practices, and I dropped out. It was too hard for me. It was too tough.
Well, trade practices was a very difficult law subject, but try doing macroeconomics with Alan Fels from 3 to 5 on a Friday afternoon. Oh. That was really tough. That was really tough. But so I went back to uni, did an MBA, and actually what had happened in our family business was my father, who'd been in business with my uncle, they decided to separate. And so my father thought that it would be great to invite his children into the business. And my father, being the enlightened person that he always was, never saw the difference between daughters and sons in being able to work in the family business. And I had always had an interest in property. In fact, I had done, whilst I'd been doing my MBA and been pregnant, I'd actually teamed up with a girlfriend who was an interior designer, and we did a few renovations, which we sold, just little property townhouses. And so my father invited me to come into the family business on the property side, as I already had a sister who was working on the retail side of our business. And so that's the way that started.
And was that in any way with a plan? Was there a progression marked out and charted out that you thought, these are the steps that I have to take before global domination comes?
No, not at all. Not at all. And in fact, when I think back on it now, it was probably too unstructured and too unplanned. And if I had a child coming into a family business, I would have, it wouldn't be as ad hoc as my entry into our family business, where it was sort of sink or swim. And, I've spoken to my father about it, who's now 97, as you know.
A sprightly 97,
very sprightly, and very involved in business still. Absolutely loves it. I would have put together a more structured sort of plan, progression plan for a child coming into a family business. But look, we were all learning, right? My father had been an immigrant to Australia, as someone coming out of the Holocaust in Europe. And, we were all learning at the same time.
Did you find it easy to make money?
What do you mean?
Well, you've run very profitable businesses. A lot of people can't do it. They just don't know how to do it, don't know how you run a business to make a profit. Lots of people can make a loss, and most businesses fail.
I know.
So was it easy to make money?
Well, it's always your losses and failures that you learn your best lessons from. And, one's successes you take for granted. And along the way, I mean, I've had lots of failures and lots of losses.
What's the biggest one?
What's the biggest one? Look, you know what? There've been so many sort of, I guess, little ones that...
well, what's the one that taught you the best lesson then?
Well, the one that taught me the best lesson, which wasn't such a failure, but it was a huge learning curve, was actually the first one, which was the aerobics and dance studio. I mean, I learned so many lessons about that. I mean, I renovated the building, for example. You know, I mean, getting tradesmen in when they say they would come into the building. You know, I'd be standing there at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, and they wouldn't come until 3 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon. So, you know, you learn all sorts of things around that. I mean, marketing and how to do a budget and, you know, and what that actually means and advertising and how to, you know, how to apportion money and what to spend things on and what not to spend things on.
So, again, that wasn't a failure. You said it was a success.
Yeah. Well, it was a success I mean, I did not make a huge amount of money out of it, but it was certainly, it was a very successful experience, put it that way.
Mm. What is the biggest failure or lesson you learned from it then? Because, I mean, a lot of people who are successful in business, they present an image, and, you know, we talked before about frailty and showing frailty.
Yeah.
They present this image that nothing ever goes wrong. Everything's always, you know, this sort of rah, 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 you know, can't set a foot wrong.
Yeah. But you know what? Business is not easy. And small business is particularly hard.
Sure.
And
anyone who's tried to do a BAS at 11 o'clock at night when it's due the next day knows that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, you know, if business was easy, there'd be a lot more really sort of successful people.
Sure,
around.
We have a 75-80% failure rate for most small business and medium businesses. I mean, you pick up the financial paper, it's full of things going bust.
Yeah.
Sometimes for mischievous and malicious reasons, other times just because people got it wrong.
Yeah. But, you know, the thing that I learned about being in business and having been in businesses, different businesses all my life, and working actually with other entrepreneurs, is that when you see things going wrong, how you roll up your sleeves and deal with it, you know? And sometimes you've got to cut your losses and get out. And other times you've got to just really roll your sleeves up and in a very determined way address the issues. And you know what else? Ask for help. Ask for help. You know, don't think that it's a failure. You're being a failure if you ask for help.
This is Monash LinkedIn Live in conversation with Carol Schwartz, leading figure in business and mentor to many emerging women through the pathway to politics. I nearly said pathways to power. Pathway to politics program that she pioneered and created and personally paid for, as she's been telling us. And your questions can come straight to my screen here using the technology and the gadgets. We do want to get to talk about the role of universities and education and the like as well.
But can I just go back to which you say personally pay for?
Yeah, sure.
Because that's not absolutely right. Because Pathways to Politics is actually funded through the Trawalla Foundation, which is a philanthropic foundation that my family, and we have external trustees, have set up, and we evaluate every opportunity that comes to us to fund. And Pathways to Politics for Women has just been a huge opportunity for us to, what we believe, really make a difference.
Sure, but you've championed it, I suppose.
Yes.
I'm shortcutting. Yeah. But I mean, what's fundamental here is, and you've said this often, and a lot of people don't either believe it or understand it, you say it's good for business to be more diverse, not just with gender, but specifically on gender. A lot of people don't get that. So explain why you're of that belief.
Well, the proof is in the pudding. I mean, you just have to look at the data around diversity and you know, the results that diverse views around a table produce. You know,
the big mining companies and the banks haven't had women on the boards until very recently. They've always been incredibly profitable. So the dinosaurs, I'll run my flag up the pole.
They're protected.
They might be, but a lot of the dinosaurs, or people sitting around the table at the club at lunch having a whiskey and a steak, I mean, they're going to say, oh, this is all a lot of, you know, woke nonsense, a lot of rubbish. Let her have her fun, but she's not going to get in the door here. So what's the argument to them that it's actually more profitable? It's better for business.
Well, as I said, the data all shows that more diverse boards actually produce more profitable businesses. I mean, and it's not only boards; it's actually diverse teams. I was at a presentation once, which was so interesting, where there was such an explicit example of the need for diversity, and this was someone who'd worked at Google gave the example of an innovation that they put forward, which was some sort of video technology. And they actually found that for a certain group of people, it failed. And why did it fail? Because they couldn't use the piece of equipment in an effective way. And why not? They hadn't had a left-handed person around the table testing this piece of equipment.
I'm left-handed.
Yeah. And so everyone who was left-handed could not use this piece of equipment.
Yep.
Isn't that a beautiful example?
Oh, well, do you want to start me on the discrimination against left-handed people? Mikey, for instance, you have to swipe your card constantly having to. Oh, it's just
That's
so
right.
inconvenient.
And try playing a right-handed ukulele if you're left-handed.
Let's not start on that. But still with business for a bit, there's a really good question here about gender deafness. We've still got gender deafness around the boardroom table and at the senior levels of management. I mean, I've got a friend who applied for a job, and in the interview she was told, well, we think the next chap will probably have the following credentials. And she went, well, I may as well leave now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there is such a thing as gender deafness. I mean, and I read about it years and years ago, actually amongst students, that when a female student would ask a question, it was basically ignored. And when a male student would ask the same question, it was actually, debated and answered.
So Laura wants me to ask specifically, has it happened to you? Have you got personal experience of it? And what would you do with it now? How would Carol Schwartz react if it happened to her right now with all the gravitas that you bring to your...
Well, I think that, firstly, I think that all women have dealt with it at some stage. I mean, I have a really, this is not a gender deafness example, but I remember a story a female colleague told me. I mean, this is a woman who was at the time the chairman of a multi-billion-dollar business. She went along to a dinner that she was invited to by the chairman of a major corporate. I'm not going to mention what that was or who it was.
Oh, just the initials.
And she goes along to this dinner, and she goes into a room, and there's a circle of men, and she's the only woman in the room. And she sort of starts to approach the circle, and of course, I don't know whether you've noticed, but circles of men don't open up in the same way as circles of women do. When circles of women seem to, when they see someone approaching, they open up and embrace them into the circle. For some reason, circles of men don't seem to do that in the same sort of way. So she sort of approached this circle, and she sort of shouldered her way in. And the chairman, he only had 12 people coming for dinner. He should have known the guest list, right? He looks down at this woman, and this guy's well over 6 foot, and this woman is quite petite. And he says to her in the circle that she just shouldered her way into, "And who might you be?"
And she was the only woman
invitee. She was the only woman invited. But imagine that. And who might you be? Oh, I'm the waitress here to take your order.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you know what I mean?
Who do you think you are, girlie? Yeah.
Yeah. It's, and this is...
So what would you do about that? I mean, I don't know how recently, if
do you know what?
it might have happened to you.
I'm sort of like, I become a little bit like a petulant 12-year-old. I become a really sort of a smart ass, and I start to get really, sort of just precocious and a bit revolting, because I just, I also feel that I'm too old to have to deal with that rubbish anymore. So I just get as belligerent as I can.
So you confront it right out there,
Absolutely.
Totally up front.
Now, what have I got to lose now? Seriously, what have I got to lose? If someone doesn't want me on their board, that's fine. I'll invent my own board.
It's probably not a board. It's the old Groucho Marx thing.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not a board you wanted to be part of anyway.
Exactly. But, it's you get to a certain stage in your life, And I remember Gillian Triggs was actually one of the presenters at Pathways to Politics after she'd left the Human Rights Commission, after all the, oh my God, the trauma that she had to deal with. And she sat in the room with these fabulous women, and she said, I am just going to be so rude and so outrageous now because I've got nothing to lose. And and she's
So
now
call
a
it out.
woman, and she's now a woman in her 70s.
So call it out is what you're saying.
Absolutely.
That
and you
works.
know what? If it's not, I mean, I'm not as old as Gillian, but seriously, if it's not up to my generation of women to now start calling it out, what hope is there for women in their 30s and 40s?
Sure, but you'd understand why a woman mid-career, say in her 40s, or someone with minimal experience trying to break into those higher ranks, you'd understand why they wouldn't do that.
Absolutely, because they're still beholden to others for their jobs, for opportunities.
Yep.
That's why it's incumbent on me and my generation of women to go out blazing. We cannot let this regress at all. And I remember talking to, women 20 years older than myself, like Wendy McCarthy and Eve Marlab, who said to me, you've just got to be vigilant the whole time because it's like one step forward, two steps back. And we saw that, in 2014, 2015, when we went from having a number of women around our cabinet table.
Well, we had a female Governor-General and a female Prime Minister,
That's right.
Female ministers in the cabinet
to
table.
one woman around our cabinet table.
So-
and, it was a bit like The Handmaid's Tale.
Not quite, but
bit like.
So have you ever been called difficult?
Always. But I take that as a compliment.
Where
Have you ever been called difficult?
wear it as a medal.
Yeah.
Wear it with pride. Let's talk about education, universities. And if you've got questions, we've got, another 10 or so minutes. So if you've got a question for Carol Schwartz.
Fast?
If you've got a question for Carol Schwartz, you better get it in now. I've got quite a few here. Don't leave it too late. If you send it in at the end, it'll be too late for me to ask it. So don't be shy. Feel free to jump in. I want to talk about universities and education because your insights now, you're a Monash graduate, proudly you studied law and arts, I think?
Arts law and then an MBA.
And what was your arts major in?
English literature.
Did you fail Beowulf the way I did in Middle English?
No, I didn't. I did very well, and my minor was in French.
Oh,
such
magnifique.
A great compliment with law, wasn't it?
No.
To do arts law?
Well, I enjoyed the arts side more. I didn't really enjoy the law side, but we'll talk about that maybe some other time. It's probably not appropriate now. But what did it mean to you? What did you get from studying arts and law that set you up that you still use so many years later?
That's such an interesting question. I actually enjoyed law more than I enjoyed arts, and I'll tell you why. I found the teaching and the learning of law much more rigorous. And it's sort of interesting because when we were at Monash Law School.
I was a few years behind you, I think.
Yeah.
And in fact, I know. And you were like, wow, you and your coterie were like, wow, they're pretty cool.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, that's so exciting. I never knew that. Really?
Yeah. And first couple of years, I hated the law school for the first few years. I don't know how you went. I loved it at the end. Yeah. Absolutely loved it. But early on, it was like, whoa, I don't get this at all.
Yeah. Well,
I nearly dropped out.
I agree with that. But how old were you when you went to the law school? I was 17. Yeah. I probably was not mature enough, which is why the Melbourne model, I think, is quite a good model.
I'd gone from an all-boys school.
Oh.
So you can imagine what it was like for the first few years.
Right. Okay. Say no more.
Don't remember much.
But I must say my final 2 years of law, I absolutely adored and actually was sort of interesting when I went back to do the MBA. I actually found I appreciated how the law school had operated at Monash even more, because the MBA, notwithstanding it was a great degree to do, was not as rigorous as my final 2 years of law, which was
So what
fabulous.
would you wish the young Carol Schwartz had been told that you now know but you didn't know then?
About studying?
About the role of education.
Oh, look, for me and my family, there was never any question about education. I mean, you know, you went to university in the same way you went to kindergarten and primary school. I mean, that it was just a natural progression. There was no way that you would not go to university. I mean, and, you know, and I know it's sort of interesting because women of my generation have said that, you know, the expectation was that they not go to university, whereas I came from a family where the expectation was you absolutely go to university. And that was probably because my father, coming from war-torn Europe, had missed that opportunity completely. Yeah.
But you were graduating at a time when women were expected to leave the workforce when they were pregnant.
Well, no, that is absolutely not true. I graduated at a time where I considered myself an absolute beneficiary of the feminists of the 70s.
Yeah, so
right?
Late 70s.
Late 70s,
yeah.
Right? And so for me, I was never going to get married, probably not have children, and I was going to be flying around the world with this major multinational corporate career, you know, and because I saw the world as my oyster. And that's the way women of my generation, or well, I guess an echelon of women of my generation felt, because we really were the beneficiaries of the Eve Marlabs and the Wendy McCarthy's, who'd done all those hard yards in the 60s. And there we were going through the 70s, believing we could have it all.
So riddle me this, as the phrase goes. Why are universities so downgraded in their relevance, their importance, and as a priority in public life and government today?
I've got no idea, because they certainly should not be. They play such a huge role in all our lives.
So here you are, a leading figure in the business community, on the board of the Reserve Bank, all the things we've been talking about. You have a view that is completely at odds with what's actually happening.
Yeah, I can't believe it. I absolutely can't believe it. I mean, look at the role universities play in our cities, in our societies. They're phenomenal. And,
Want a vaccine? Anybody want a vaccine? Where are you going to get a vaccine from? Oh, that's right, from medical research. Where do you do medical research? At a university.
Absolutely. And, I mean, look at all the innovations that come out of universities. And, you know, it's unbelievable what the conversation around universities in Australia, where everywhere else in the world, and particularly Asia, you know, the investment that's happening in universities is just massive.
We're being left behind. So what did the law mean to you when you got out into the workforce, when you got into business, as you got out there establishing an aerobic studio? I knew nothing about that.
Well, of course you need a law degree to establish an aerobic studio, right? But, you know, my experience was really interesting, because my final 2 years of law, I loved studying law. But then getting articles, I believe they've abolished articles now.
They have,
yeah. But we had to do
articles. Did you get
articles.
admitted? You went through and...
I did articles, because I thought, well, you know, you've just got to finish it. But my articles experience was not a great experience. And also I could not believe that the intellectual exercise that I'd been through at university with law, and the training that we did, you know, and, you know, the incredibly complex problem solving that we had to do, going into articles was just ludicrous. I mean, you know,
but do you use it all the time now, those same skills, the thinking, the understanding, the insight?
I think that it sets your neural pathways in a particular way that actually really helps you. I mean, and I still remember, you know, Valenti non-fit injuria and, you know, and administrative law I absolutely loved. And I mean, that we apply in our thinking all the time, don't we, around natural justice and the way the regulatory and compliance environments work. I mean, I think that studying law has been fantastic.
It becomes part of your way of thinking and part of your
Absolutely.
DNA, your commercial DNA.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It is. Your neural networks
Yeah.
are framed in a particular way.
I've always said to young aspiring law students, kids who have said, oh, should I study law or not? Say, sure, I can teach you a law degree in one word, virtually one sentence, but there's a whole lot more to it. But it's all about power. By what power? The whole law degree comes down to by what power can someone do something, whether it's in a commercial contract or whether you're talking about aviation law or you're talking about the Constitution or contracts or torts, or it doesn't matter. How can you make someone do something? But then there's a whole lot more to learn how that's applied.
Yeah, absolutely. But it also, in a way, I think it teaches you how to question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It gives you a confidence to question.
Exactly. Absolutely.
There's a really great question here. It's come in late, but I'm going to try and get you to grapple with it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
If women have to be aggressive or firm where they're the only one in the boardroom, the only woman in the boardroom, aren't you masculinizing women? And doesn't that uphold the gendered expectations from women to be more manly? To behave more like men to succeed?
Yeah. Yes. But, you know, we all adopt different techniques in different contexts in order to make a point, right? So I don't see that, you know, if in a particular context, in order to get a point across, you have to behave in a particular way that may be characterised as being masculine or manly, but maybe it's actually not masculine or manly. Maybe it's just the most effective way of getting a point across in a particular context.
I think women's assertiveness is quite different to men's assertiveness.
No, it's interpreted differently.
Well, no, men tend to turn into bullies when they're being assertive, whereas women, you said before, you want to be a difficult woman, but that's not by being a bully, although some women can be bullies, but it's a different way of trying to persuade people to a point of view, isn't it?
Maybe. Not all the time. Not all the time.
And then there's that complaint. A lot of women say, oh, well, the worst boss I ever had was another woman.
Yeah. I'm always shocked by that. And actually, I did a talk at a group of lawyers who had some clients there as well, one International Women's Day. And it was so interesting because the ones who complain about other women are women lawyers who say that their worst experiences with bosses were other women. But when I asked the women who had that experience to put their hands up in this group, it was the women lawyers. And it's so interesting because if you think about it, like, and I'm not sure what it's like now in the legal profession, although I know that, you know, still when you look at law firms, the minority partnership of, you know, minority number of women who are in partnership is atrocious when you think that over 60% of the law graduates are women, and how few make it to partnership. But, you know, I can remember my daughter, my oldest daughter, who actually did law, and then did her articles and practice law for a couple of years, which I never did. She said to me, Mum, I can't see any women lawyer role models that I would want to model my life on.
Jennifer's comment is pretty much a good point to almost end it on. The discussion's been fantastic, honest, inspiring, and so relevant. And Carol's contribution just can't be measured as a pathway to politics participant.
Oh, thank you.
Thank
That's
you,
very
Jennifer.
sweet. Thank you.
But in fact, my final question for you is, it's often remarked that there aren't many statues in the City of Women. So when there is a statue of Carol Schwartz in the city, what does it say at the bottom? Philanthropist.
Difficult.
A difficult woman.
Difficult. Yeah, a difficult woman. And you know Claire Wright, the wonderful author.
Historian.
Yeah, yep. Historian. And she's actually, is she a political scientist at La Trobe Uni? She's brilliant academic.
She writes about women's role in political history.
That's right. Well, she did that wonderful book on the Eureka women. She's actually working very hard at making sure that we do have statues of women in Australia. So watch that space.
Carol Schwartz, difficult woman. It's been fabulous, and thank you very, very much for being the first of our In Conversations live on LinkedIn for Monash University, Monash Law. And thank you all for joining in and for your excellent questions, which have helped guide the conversation. Now, we do hope, it's not, COVID's very hard for planning, but we do hope that we'll be able to have another one of these next month and the month after, and there's a series of 4. I hope you'll come back and join us for the next one. But thank you very much for joining us tonight, and good night.